Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, is one of the most infamous figures of the Holocaust. A Nazi physician stationed at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, Mengele's name is forever etched in history for his sadistic and inhumane experiments on prisoners, particularly twins. Born in Günzburg, Germany in 1911, Mengele rose through the ranks of the SS, becoming a key figure in Hitler's regime due to his fervent belief in Aryan supremacy and eugenics. In Auschwitz, Mengele played a dual role. As a doctor, he made life and death decisions at the camp's selection ramps. Arriving prisoners, most of them Jews, would be separated into two groups, those sent immediately to the gas chambers and those selected for forced labor or experimentation. But Mengele was no ordinary doctor. His interest lay not in healing, but in experimenting on live human subjects. His special focus was on twins, and he would conduct brutal, grotesque experiments on them in an attempt to unlock the secrets of genetic engineering. He sought to prove Nazi racial theories by experimenting on the weak and vulnerable, pushing the boundaries of medical ethics into the depths of horror. Mengele was obsessed with unraveling the mysteries of genetics, particularly in the quest for creating a master race, a core Nazi goal. By studying twins, he hoped to discover ways to increase the birth rate of Aryan children and eliminate undesirable traits from the population. He wanted to scientifically validate Nazi theories of racial purity by proving the biological superiority of the Aryan race. His twisted quest for medical knowledge drove him to commit some of the most heinous crimes of the Holocaust. In his makeshift laboratories in Auschwitz, Mengele performed horrific experiments that included amputations, injections of deadly diseases, and forced sterilizations. Many of his subjects, especially the children, died as a result of these torturous procedures, often in extreme agony. Those who survived were left permanently disfigured or mentally scarred. Mengele viewed them not as human beings, but as mere specimens for his perverse scientific research. Mengele's ambition to create a scientific foundation for the Nazis' genocidal racial policies collapsed along with the Third Reich in 1945. The liberation of Auschwitz by the Soviet Red Army on January 27, 1945, brought an end to his experiments and his ability to continue the pursuit of his twisted goals. The collapse of the Nazi regime meant the halt of his access to human subjects, and the world began to uncover the true extent of the atrocities committed at concentration camps like Auschwitz. Despite his role in mass murder and human experimentation, Mengele managed to evade capture. As Allied forces advanced across Europe, many Nazi officials were hunted down, captured, and tried for their crimes during the Nuremberg trials. But Mengele, thanks to his meticulous planning and help from Nazi sympathizers, was able to slip away. He fled to South America, where he would live in hiding for decades, constantly pursued by Nazi hunters, but always just out of reach. After the war, Mengele used false papers to avoid being identified. He initially fled to Bavaria, where he lived under the radar for several years. In 1949, with the help of a network of Nazi sympathizers, including the Odessa organization, which helped smuggle war criminals out of Europe, Mengele made his way to Argentina. In Buenos Aires, he lived under an assumed name and even managed to establish himself as a businessman. Over the next decade, Mengele moved between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, always fearful that his past would catch up with him. Despite the relentless pursuit by Nazi hunters, including the Mossad, Mengele remained one step ahead. The Israeli Secret Service captured Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, in Argentina in 1960, but Mengele was already on the move, having sensed the walls closing in on him. His ability to evade justice became one of the most frustrating chapters for those who sought to bring him to trial for his crimes. Mengele was never caught by the authorities, and for years he lived a quiet and obscure life. But he never felt truly safe. He lived in constant paranoia, aware that at any moment he could be captured. His health deteriorated over time, and despite being able to avoid the gallows, he could never escape the weight of his own guilt or the fear of retribution. Though Mengele avoided the formal justice system, his life was far from peaceful. The psychological toll of being hunted, constantly changing identities, and moving from one safe house to another left him a broken man. The very paranoia that kept him alive also consumed him. He became increasingly isolated, living in rural Brazil, under poor conditions with minimal contact with the outside world. He lived in fear of being recognized, unable to trust even those closest to him. In 1979, Mengele's past finally caught up with him in a tragic, albeit ironic way. While swimming at a beach near São Paulo, Brazil, he suffered a stroke and drowned. His body was buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard, the alias he had been using for years. It wasn't until 1985, when Nazi hunters and forensic scientists uncovered his grave, that the world learned of his death. Josef Mengele's death was neither glorious nor just, but it was fitting for a man who had brought so much pain and suffering to others. He died alone, far from the grandeur he had once sought within the Nazi regime. His drowning was a painful death, a fate he could not escape despite decades of running from justice. Mengele never faced trial, but the discovery of his remains in 1985 allowed the world to close the final chapter on the life of one of history's most notorious war criminals. While many had hoped for a public trial, where his crimes would be laid bare for the world to see, his lonely and fearful existence in South America, followed by a painful death, was its own form of punishment. His passing brought a sense of closure to the families of his victims, even if justice was never formally served in a courtroom. Josef Mengele's death may have been quick, but the legacy of his crimes endures. His experiments on over 1,000 twins and countless other victims at Auschwitz remain some of the darkest examples of human cruelty. Mengele's victims were not just numbers, they were real people who suffered unimaginable pain at his hands. His twisted fascination with genetics led him to commit acts that defy all notions of medical ethics and humanity. The discovery of Mengele's remains in 1985 confirmed what many had suspected for years, that the angel of death had lived out his final years in fear and isolation. For decades, survivors of Auschwitz had spoken about the horrors of Mengele's experiments, stories of twins being sewn together, children injected with chemicals that caused blindness or death, and victims tortured under the guise of science. Mengele's actions left deep scars on the Jewish community and on all those who suffered under the Nazi regime. Though Mengele died without facing formal justice, his story serves as a reminder of the atrocities committed during the Holocaust and the importance of ensuring that such crimes are never forgotten. His ability to evade capture for so long frustrated those who sought to bring him to trial, but his death was a small form of poetic justice. His body now lies in an unmarked grave, forgotten and abandoned, just as he had abandoned the humanity of his victims. Josef Mengele will forever be remembered not as a doctor or scientist, but as a sadistic executioner who used his medical training to inflict pain and death. The twins he experimented on, the children he disfigured, and the prisoners he sent to the gas chambers will forever haunt his legacy. His death may have been fittingly painful, but it pales in comparison to the suffering he caused.